It's officially that time. We are back with another deep dive on another Kingdom Cup type Pokemon. This Pokemon is kind of revered for several reasons, but mainly because of how just completely tanky this Pokemon is in the Great League because of its stats being so close to 1500 for maxing out at level 40. This Pokemon is a beast. Without further ado, that Pokemon is actually going to be Bastiodon. So Bastiodon is a Rock and Steel type Pokemon. At level 40 max IVs, you can actually get this sucker up to 1539. So maxing out right about 1500 has really shown to be good in a lot of scenarios because it really means that you get the full stat package of your Pokemon. Generally, Medicham is a really good example. Maxing out below 1500 means that you get an absurd amount of your stats being used. You can actually achieve a 1497 at level 40. This one's kind of interesting because we do max out at 1539. You actually can achieve 1497 with a 12 on attack, 15 defense, and 15 stamina. So that's really cool. I really like the aspect of being able to utilize more of your IV spread than just automatically assuming the best IV spread starts with a 0 in attack. I kind of hate that, but in this scenario, does really good. So Bastiodon, according to my spreadsheet, my calculations, and all of my good stuff, I found that Bastiodon is the #1 bulkiest Pokemon out of all of the Kingdom Cup Pokemon. So there's around 115 participants in the Kingdom Cup, and having that #1 spot in bulk is pretty freaking sweet. And he has it by a pretty large margin. I think I'd have to run the numbers, but it's several percent. Next, we actually have 10th in stat products. So Bastiodon does definitely have a pretty big package as far as stats go, except if you look at his base stats, he doesn't really have like anything in the attack department. He really lacks a lot of the attack stat, which ends up making him really good in this cup and in Great League in general, because you can push him so high and not have to worry so much about his attack. So being 10th in stat product, don't let that fool you. That actually is really good. It's a really nice stat setup that Bastiodon has here. Being that Bastiodon is a Rock and Steel type Pokemon, I do actually have our moves color coded here. So starting with our quick moves, we do actually have Smackdown and Iron Tail. Both of those are going to be a stab candidate there. Smackdown being a rock type move, 2.6 energy per turn, 4 damage per turn. A really solid move all around. Then we actually have Iron Tail doing 2 energy per turn for 3 damage per turn. Quite respectable, but in every aspect, Smackdown is just it's just a better move here. The only thing is that maybe in certain situations it would be beneficial to have a Steel type move, but I can't really think of any, because the main thing that we're going to be using Bastiodon for really has him call for this Smackdown here. Next, we actually have on our charge moves, we have Stone Edge, Flamethrower, and Flash Cannon. So Stone Edge costing 55 energy, doing 100 damage for a 1.82 damage per energy ratio. Flamethrower is actually, of course, a fire type move, costing 55, doing 90 damage at 1.64 damage per energy ratio. Then we actually have Flash Cannon here, being a steel type move, costing 65 for 110 damage at a 1.69 damage per energy ratio. So that is a really nice little setup. The reason is because, especially in the Kingdom Cup, being that we have ice type Pokemon, Bastiodon has a really nice little setup with Smackdown being able to do quite the super effective damage to a lot of the ice types, but it also has Flamethrower, which can really help make or break certain matchups for you because you need to push a ton of super effective damage at once to just get the match over with. So Flamethrower is a really nice addition. Stone Edge I really like. I think my preferred moveset on Bastiodon ends up going to Smackdown, Stone Edge, and Flamethrower. So the reason for that is that Smackdown and Stone Edge are really going to drive home one of 2 purposes for us, and Flamethrower is going to drive home that second purpose, which we will get to just in a second. In all of our deep dive lore, let's actually go over some positives and negatives here. Let's actually start with our negatives. So our first negative is probably the biggest negative to Bastiodon, and that's his cost. He is going to cost you quite the resources to get a good one. So the problem, maxing out at level 40, it kind of falls into that Metacham area where Metacham was such a staple in the Boulder Cup, but it was so costly to get. And if you didn't have like a 100% IV, it just kind of felt underwhelming to put that much resources into a Pokemon that just wasn't there. Kind of goes into the same situation for Bastiodon for me. The fact that I'm going to spend so many candies and so much dust getting this suck up to freaking level 40, it just really hurts me. Now, the only like silver lining around this negative is the fact that if you do end up using Shieldon, or if you just straight up trade Bastiodons and you end up getting a lucky one, the floor for lucky is 12, 12, 12, meaning that you at least have a really good Bastiodon once you max it out, although it is still going to cost you quite the resources depending on what level you trade it at to get that lucky. Our next negative is actually the fact that we end up having two quad weaknesses, and that's going to be to fighting and ground. So when we get into our matchups, you'll kind of notice there's a theme. Bastiodon basically wins against everything that isn't fighting and ground. He does lose to a couple of different things, but Bastiodon just has a really hard time when it comes to those two typings because he just can't, he doesn't have enough to really hold out in those types of matches, so it ends up being a really bad, glaring weakness to Bastiodon. Moving over to our positives, so just kind of like we just talked about with Lucario yesterday, today is kind of a similar story. Positives are going to start with resistances. I mean, Bastiodon has an insane amount of resistances. It's crazy. But the two like big important ones are actually going to be Dragon and Ice. The fact that you're going to resist two typings out of the meta is a really, really good thing. That means that you can actually resist a ton of the threats in this cup. Our next positive is actually that we have a huge flex of stats here. So the fact that Bastiodon does reach level 40 does mean that you can really flex out Bastiodon, really get a lot out of your Pokemon. Being that you can max him out right under 1500 just really makes it just fleshed out. He gets all of his stats really well utilized, and he just ends up being a really, really good pick. Typically what I do with the deep dive Pokemon is I end up putting them up against the top 10 bulkiest Pokemon in the league and just kind of see how they do against those bulky Pokemon. Since Bastiodon is of course first in bulk, I didn't run any mirror matches because it really just kind of depends on which moveset you end up going with. Flamethrower would probably be the best one to go with because it at least do neutral damage to Bastiodon himself. Up against the top 10 bulkiest Pokemon, we actually only lose to two of them. Those two end up being Registeel and Steelix. So Registeel has access to quite a few fighting moves, and Steelix has access to ground type moves. So that's kind of where those two losses come from. But on the opposite side, we actually end up winning Dugong, Altaria, Regice, Lapras, Skarmory, Torkoal, and Forretress. All of those you can pretty much win with not that bad of a time. You actually end up doing pretty well against those 8 Pokemon. I just realized that's only 7. Looking at our shield situation, I did run several different simulations trying to figure out, where the shields should be utilized when it comes to Bastiodon. And in a scenario where it's no shields versus no shields, both players end up having no shields to utilize, Bastiodon actually wins 84.6% of the matchups. So that's pretty big. The fact that you win almost 85% of the matchups is huge. That's crazy. Then we actually move on to 0 shields versus 2 shields. So in the situation where your opponent has both shields and you have exhausted both of yours, you actually end up winning about 44.9% of your matchups. And this is kind of where I think Bastiodon's purpose really gets shown, because the Pokemon that you end up winning against in that scenario are going to be Ice types and Flying types. The fact that you have Rock type moves, it just really helps you secure that purpose on your team. you actually have rock type, and then you end up having this fire type to help you cover the ice types. But in general, he does really good against both ice and flying. So that's where it started to become really apparent that that kind of is his purpose, is to help you take down ice typing and flying type Pokemon. Next, we actually ran a scenario where I used 2 shields for Bastiodon and no shields for the opponent. So in the scenario where I have both of my shields left, my opponent has 0 shields, you end up winning 96.2% of the matches. So what this actually tells me is that we're just going to straight up lose to certain Pokemon, and we probably shouldn't even try to waste shields on trying to survive it. I wrote down 3 Pokemon that we're actually going to be just obliterated by. That would be Flygon, Empoleon, and Steelix. Those 3 seem like really good hard counters to Bastiodon himself. He's got such a strangle on those Pokemon. It's so hard to get past Flygon being able to use Mudshot and Earthquake, and then Steelix having access to Earthquake as well, and Empoleon actually doing surprisingly well with Water-type moves. Water-type moves are actually Bastiodon's only other weakness other than fighting and ground. So Empoleon actually does pull out very favorably against Bastiodon here. So I definitely think Empoleon may be worth looking at for this meta, because Empoleon winning against Bastiodon, the #1 bulkiest Pokemon, plus having access to Water-type moves to help cover Fire-type Pokemon, that could be pretty good. And then, of course, lastly, I check for me having 2 shields and the opponent having 2 shields, just straight up as a lead. Let's see how many matches we end up winning, and we actually end up winning 74.4% of the matches. So, as you can kind of see, shields are kind of a big deal for Bastiodon, but they're not as much as some of the other Pokemon. Like, the fact that we win 44.9% of the matchups not having any shields and giving the opponent 2 shields. What was it towards the end of the Tempest Cup? I was finding Pokemon that would only win like 8%. Like, it's something insane. Like, that's crazy that Bastiodon can win almost 45%. Last but not least here, our last section on a deep dive, let's actually go over the counters and kind of what Pokemon you should be focusing on using Bastiodon for, and what Pokemon you should be using to counter Bastiodon. So, as far as the counters go, Lucario is a great counter. Lucario just literally shreds through Bastiodon. It's no surprise there. Fighting type, power-up punch, you know the whole spiel. Alolan Dugtrio can actually do quite well because he has access to 2 ground-type moves. I'm pretty sure he has access to Earthquake, but he has really nice ground coverage, and it ends up making Bastiodon kind of look like a wimp whenever it goes up against Alolan Dugtrio. And then the other 2 that we've already talked about is Flygon and Empoleon. Both of those end up doing really well against Bastiodon, and honestly, those 4 are kind of like the big 4. I mean, granted, there are others that can beat Bastiodon, but those are kind of the biggest ones that I found. They win fairly easily. They're pretty much hard counters to Bastiodon. Now, in what terms should you be using Bastiodon for? I definitely think you should be using Bastiodon for your Ice-type opponents, and definitely your Flying types. So things like Articuno, Ninetales, Salamence, Altaria, things like that really have a hard time overcoming Bastiodon's Rock-type moves, and then, of course, this Flamethrower right here. So it makes a lot of sense to focus Bastiodon in terms of those Ice and Flying types. In most of the matchups, he does really, really well. There are certain ones that he kind of struggles with, but in general terms, Ice and Flying should be your main targets with Bastiodon. Do I recommend Bastiodon? Yeah, if you can get one, and you can get a good one and at a decent price. Yeah, if you find a sale on them, let me know, because I'd love to go get one. But either way, definitely think that Bastiodon is really great. I don't know how much I like leading with him. I definitely feel like he's a good mid. I feel like he's probably better as a mid to be thrown out whenever your opponent has Ice types and Flying types coming at you, because otherwise you can get really, really hard countered by some of the other Pokemon in the cup. So, I mean, as a closer, he actually does really good. You know, no shields versus no shields, 84.6% of the matchups. That's pretty good. But I definitely would stay on the mid to closer side. I don't know how much I would actually lead with a Bastiodon. I feel like I could get caught with my pants down. So yeah, that is actually it for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching these deep dives. I really do appreciate it. If you have any Pokemon that you're looking forward to me looking at, please let me know down in the comments below. I'm going to start literally as you're watching this video. I'm probably already recording the next deep dive, so I've probably already started tallying and going through everything and chose who I'm going to choose. But anyways, so thank you guys so much for watching. If you like to like videos, make sure you do that. If you don't, I don't care. You could be that guy. Otherwise, let me know what you have to say down in those comments below. And until tomorrow, I will catch you guys then.